Okay, great. Thank you very much for joining this video chat with me. And we're doing this for Taipei Game Developers Forum 2022. And it's great to have Lars to talk about blockchains and NFTs and all that juicy stuff. So how about you give a very quick, short self-introduction so that people from our audience can know you?
Okay, so my name is Lars A. I'm a Norwegian Texan, so I'm a citizen of both countries. I live in Texas, and my background for the past 10, 12 years has been in video games. For about better part of the last year, I've been a consultant, and specifically in the blockchain gaming space. I've done a lot of analysis and number crunching and writing for a consultancy firm called Naavik. And Naavik, one of their specialties is blockchain gaming analysis. And so I've done a lot of project deconstructions of all the major blockchain games in the space and querying lots of numbers and just breaking things down from a numerical analysis perspective. And so some background that kind of led me to this kind of position was previously I've worked for companies like Valve as a contractor and consultant. I worked on the Steam Labs initiative to kind of overhaul various aspects of Steam's internal taxonomy and the way they organize and categorize games. And then I've run this site called Game Data Crunch, which collects game industry data, performance statistics and stuff for every game on Steam and things like that. And so I have a background in numerical and quantitative analysis. But then I'm also a game designer. And so I brought those two skills together for my consulting work and my analysis work at Naavik and specifically applied them to blockchain.
Mm-hmm. So I guess this collaboration between you and Naavik is quite interesting because just from reading up the analysis that you did, it does feels like you are at least neutral, not pro blockchain or NFT or pro Web3 kind of perspective. However, Naavik seems to be a consulting company explicitly for Web3 and blockchain. So can you say a little more about how they're coming from and when they hire you to do the research, what is your expectation going into this collaboration?
I mean, I can't entirely speak for Naavik, but my perception of them is that they don't want to be only about blockchain. Mm-hmm. They want to be more about games in general, kind of like what Gamasutra, was in the early days of the game industry, is like the only place for game developers to kind of come together and share a lot of insight. And as much as I like Gamasutra and Game Developer, it's basically just kind of a blog these days. Naavik, as I understand it, wants to really be kind of just a big hotshot consultancy where a lot of people come together and post deep dives and analysis and stuff. And then because they launched kind of right when Web3 was blowing up, that seemed to be kind of the hot topic. And so they dove right into it. As for me, it's quite charitable of you to say that I'm fairly neutral on blockchain. Most people would consider me a hardcore skeptic. But it is kind of interesting, right? Because there'll be a lot of pieces on Naavik that, are written by other writers who are a lot more pro than I am, right? And so it provides this kind of contrast. If everyone's really into Web3 right now, then what am I doing here? That was kind of the impression I had at first when they reached out to me. Is it's well, what do you want me for? You know my perspective. I'm fairly negative on these things, and they wanted me anyway. Because they said we're interested in the analysis, and you do good analysis, so let's have it. And I was like, okay, are you going to make me pull all my punches and stuff? And they're like, well, if you follow the data, we'll publish it. And so far they've held up to their promise, and so I enjoy working with them. Doesn't mean I necessarily agree with stuff the other writers write, and they probably don't agree with stuff I write, but I'm happy to share the platform with them. And I respect them as colleagues. So that's kind of how it works. I mean, I guess it's kind of like working for any publication, right? That has a diversity of opinions.
So there are so many topics kind of related to Web3 and blockchain and all the buzzwords. So due to the time limitation we kind of have to assume the audience already know the basics of blockchain technology. And also, we assume they know the rough idea of cryptocurrencies and the proof of stake or proof of work kind of thing. However, there's a lot of things still we have to set up some baseline first. So such as what is play to earn and why the supposed benefits of blockchain in video games are. They are usually questioned despite all the GameFi success stories so far. So let's talk about what is play to earn or GameFi, and why is it coupled with the current trend of cryptocurrencies and NFTs?
Right. Okay. So just really, really quickly. So GameFi, the phi on the end of all these little words stands for finance. So like DeFi stands for decentralized finance, as opposed to TradFi, which means traditional finance. And GameFi is games plus finance.
Right.
And play to earn is an interesting slogan because it's already obsolete. What it means is exactly what it sounds like. You get paid money for playing games. You play games, you earn money, right? And it's already become obsolete by some of its own proponents, because play to earn sort of implies that everyone's going to be able to earn money just playing the game. And long story short, all those business models have proven just as unsustainable as they sound. And so even the previous advocates of play to earn, including like Sky Mavis and Axie Infinity, if you look at their messaging, they've mostly shifted to play and earn, which suggests that only some people will be able to cash out for playing, because no system can be sustainable if more money goes out than goes in.
Right, got it. So in this way, like, do we consider the traditional or conventional real money trading since the beginning of MMORPGs? Do we consider them GameFi in a way, or?
Yeah. I mean, if you wanted to be like really pedantic, I mean, you can draw a connection there. Like in a sense, like gold farming is nothing new. People playing a game professionally is nothing new. That's esports, right? And people selling their accounts or cashing out for real money in games is nothing new. But what is new is kind of the intentionality of it. In a lot of old games where you could like cash out for real money, it was often unintended or unwanted by the developers. There's a couple of cases where developers actually endorsed it, like the real money auction house in Diablo 3 that briefly existed. But generally speaking, I would say GameFi is new in the sense of it's a new intention. It's very deliberate. Like, it's not like, let's make a game and then also, like, I guess we could do some real money trading. It's like, let's do some real money trading, and then I guess we'll also maybe put a game on it. And that's kind of the difference, is that the financial aspect kind of comes first, and then the game kind of is built and layered on top of it. Even when you talk about the talent of who mostly is making these games, at least in the early stages, it's mostly been people coming out of finance and blockchain, then kind of finding a little bit of game dev talent and building on that way, rather than too many native game developers going and being like, okay, and now let's stick a blockchain on this. Although there has been a couple of cases of that. So I would say it's mostly a new thing in terms of approach and intention.
Okay, got it. So I guess the next baseline that we want to set up is so-called NFTs. So as far as I know, there are a lot of use cases for NFTs and the underlying blockchains. But we are going to like mainly just focus on video game related NFTs and blockchains. So what are the main issues you see with such implementations in games as advertised by NFT proponents?
Okay, so NFT stands for non-fungible token, and it basically means it's basically a certificate of ownership that you own a thing. And what it is in practice is it is a number on a blockchain that says that you own something. And the challenge is typically that it is very, very difficult to build an entirely on-chain game. That is a game that completely lives on the blockchain. There are like one or two examples. They're mostly of academic interest at this stage. Nothing super popular has been created yet that is fully on-chain, but there are a couple interesting examples. And so the majority of like actual like headline-grabbing games, what they'll do is all the stuff like a regular person cares about exists off of the blockchain. But then basically a digital receipt, the NFT, lives on the blockchain. So it's like, I care that I own like an epic Mystic Pikachu, but what I have on the blockchain is a hash for 3478269, right? And the connection between that and my like epic Mystic Pikachu is basically me trusting the developer's centralized service. You know, they've created this centralized service that connects to the decentralized blockchain, and the decentralized blockchain contains my so-called ownership record. But the actual thing I care about lives over there, and I have to trust them to maintain that. and they can change that anytime they want, that would typically like devalue my purchase. And so you would think they wouldn't be incentivized to do that, but sometimes they have to like rebalance the game because a card or a character is OP, and that's going to change the value on the market of what I paid for something. I might have bought it because it was OP, and now after a balance change after a season, it goes down in value. And so that's the biggest challenge. And it's just a restatement of what's called the Oracle problem, which is basically a blockchain typically, whenever it calls out to a service outside of itself, that outside service is called an oracle. For whether the blockchain needs to know what time it is or what the price of $1 is or what is my epic mystic Pikachu looks like, right? Because the actual data is stored elsewhere. So the main issue is that the main thing NFTs are supposed to do, the main benefit is that they're supposed to give you true, real ownership, right? And the problem with this is that ownership as a concept, it's a politically embodied concept. And ownership is not one thing. It's actually what we call a bundle of rights. So like I've got some pens here in my hand. You can think of this as my bundle of rights. Like when I say I own, like let's say I own this pen, right? There are several sticks in my bundle of rights for owning this pen. One of those rights is the right to exclude other people from it. So I have the right, if you ask for my pen, to say no. I also have the right to destroy my pen if I want to just like set it on fire or crush it. I have the right to use my pen. I have the right to transfer ownership of my pen. I have the right to sell my pen for money. I have the right to take pictures of my pen. I have all these rights, but each of those is individual. And under most legal codes, sometimes those are separable. When you talk about what rights do you have over an NFT, and you think of that bundle of rights, right? Really, the only one that the blockchain really gives you is the right of transfer. I can transfer or sell it to someone else, but all these other rights depend on things outside the blockchain. There's the Oracle problem again. And this has been exemplified pretty dramatically through the case of Seth Green, who owned a Bored Ape NFT and was going to make a cartoon based off of that because the Bored Apes say that you own the copyright if you own the NFT. But then, of course, he lost his NFT. Someone social engineered it away from him, sold it to someone else. And now who owns the copyright? Copyright exists outside of the blockchain. And now there's this whole dispute. And so I would say that the Oracle problem and just a lack of appreciation for how rights actually work and interface in the real world makes it so that the ownership claim of NFTs is philosophically undercooked and therefore doesn't deliver what it promises, in my opinion.
I see. So I think a lot of that can be summarized in the idea of enforceability. How do you enforce the ownership and what is actually given to the owner of that thing? But do you think the claim of decentralization a central part of NFT or GameFi nowadays, or like that is just a smokescreen that people set up when they discuss them?
Well, I think decentralization is a really cool idea, and I wish it was actually delivered in most cases. Because when we say decentralization, like the principle of the blockchain is it's built off of three main principles, which are decentralization, trustlessness, and irreversibility, right? And it's all these nodes cooperating together. Two, it's trustless so that you don't have to trust anyone. The math makes it so that even if some of us are evil or bad actors, we can still achieve consensus about the blockchain ledger. And then third, it's irreversible so that no one can go in and monkey with records once they've been done. The problem is that most of these services compromise away those first two principles, decentralization and trustlessness. They usually insert a centralized, trusted service into the mix somewhere. And then all we're left with is irreversibility. And I would argue that irreversibility is not actually this feature that everybody really, really wants if you also don't have decentralization and you don't have trustlessness. And a perfect example of that is the Axie Infinity hack, where it's like, okay, $625 million got stolen by North Korea because we trusted 9 nodes not to get compromised, one centralized service. But then when it went bad, it escaped to Ethereum. And so it's just blockchainy enough that there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. Like, I hate big evil banks as much as the next guy. But the one thing you can say big evil banks have going for them is they can occasionally reverse a fraudulent transaction. And so that's kind of the problem sometimes with the modern incarnation of blockchain, is that you sometimes wind up with the worst of both worlds. And so I like the concept of decentralization in principle. I find in practice, we mostly are not being totally honest about how centralized and trusted the services really are. and whether we're making the wrong trade-offs.
Exactly. So since you mentioned Axie Infinity, let's maybe jump into the main topic that we are going to be discussing today. So can you very briefly describe what the gameplay of Axie Infinity is, just for the audience that may not be familiar with the game, and also why it does require NFTs and cryptos, and what caused its huge growth, last year?
Okay, yeah. Axie Infinity was the poster child for play-to-earn gaming back in the day, which is, I don't have the charts in front of me, but last June, last July is when it exploded. And it had been in development for several years. The founders met by playing a previous NFT game called CryptoKitties. And so the entire notion of it is, you can tell it's very inspired by games like Magic the Gathering. Just this notion of, it's okay, Magic the Gathering's original premise is well, trading cards exist, but wouldn't it be fun if you could play a game with those trading cards? And it was very successful, right? Mm-hmm. And so it proved that you could make a game out of a collectible set of cards. And so Axie Infinity was well, can we do that on the blockchain? CryptoKitties kind of put NFTs on the map. And so the founders were okay, well, let's take the next step. Let's come up with a little Pokemon-style game. And you buy these little creatures called Axies. I think maybe they're supposed to be loosely based off of axolotls, and that's where the name Axie comes from. And so each of them, they have little genetic features. You can breed them. And so they all come out different. They have little powers and stuff. And the core of the game is about battling against each other. And what made it go huge back in 2021, two things made it go huge. First of all, they made it so that you could earn real money playing the game. They set up this circular economy where you could battle against people. And as your matchmaking ranking went up and you won battles, you would be rewarded with these things called smooth love potions, which was a token that they had. And then you could use that token. They created demand for that token by making it the currency you would spend to breed new Axies. They set up this kind of circular economy where it's oh, you get rewarded with this token, but why should anyone care? Well, people will want to buy that token from you so they can breed Axies. And they're going to want to breed Axies because people will want to be able to buy those Axies so that they can play the game. And they're going to want to play the game because they see that you can earn real money doing it. So they got some growth and it was going okay, but they were built on Ethereum. And the problem with Ethereum is because Ethereum is this, proof of work chain, and because of all of its congestion, there were very high transaction fees and it was very, very slow. So you can see you have a problem where it's if you go to a vending machine, you have to pay $50 in transaction fees to buy a 50-cent Snickers bar. That's going to put a hamper on your economy, right? Yeah. So they built a L2 chain called Ronin, a layer 2 chain, a side chain that routes around Ethereum. And they moved all their assets over there. And it was a proof of stake chain that they owned. And when they did that, their whole economy just exploded and went to the moon because their transaction fees basically went to zero. Then everyone got in on the play-to-earn game. It got really, really popular. People in the Philippines started playing it professionally as a way to supplement and then even replace daily income. It got super big. And now it's kind of on its way down after that cycle has ended.
Okay, so of course we encourage the audience to read up the Navic analysis of Axie up to, I think, late 2021. And since there are a lot of detailed research about what went right and what went wrong in that post, I think it's currently still free. But also, there's probably going to be a multiple-hour read if you really want to consume it very thoroughly, including all the reference materials. So I just want to be very quickly state my takeaway. Do you think it's fair to say that Axie, maybe by extension, games strive to be like Axie, are mainly troubled by two problems? So the first problem obviously is the balance of the tokenomics and around so-called scholars, because they have to rent the tokens just to play the game. And when the game is popular, the tokens are so expensive. Also, this idea that the P2E model doesn't really work when people are extracting more monetary value from the ecosystem than they put into it. So this is my first takeaway from that report. And the second takeaway that I have is, I think the issue around the land gameplay, which is very interesting, even without being related to crypto. The land gameplay itself has been a big problem for all the MMORPGs that have this system back in the days. Do you think that's a fair summary of the report?
Yeah. I mean, the report is pretty big and sprawling, and we're going to do a follow-up soon. So it might even be out by the time this recording goes up.
I see.
I'll let you know. But yeah, so I'm actively researching what's happened since. And so I think that's a pretty fair assessment. The main issue is that basically it's pretty simple. Play to earn is unsustainable. And even the founders themselves admit that. And that's why they say play and earn now. Everyone in this space will tell you that at best they will say, well, play to earn was okay because we had this plan to just use that basically as like growth hacking. And then we're going to plan to like jump off the roller coaster and onto the mountaintop, transition to a sustainable economy. And my kind of retort to that is like, that's much harder to pull off than you think. And it's very easy to get addicted to that growth curve and then not have a plan for transitioning. Secondly, the issue with land gameplay, I mean, I could write a whole book about that. But what the report talked about is that basically what we see in crypto game, like land gameplay is this very common thing that a lot of crypto games do, where you basically pre-sell virtual land, virtual real estate that are going to be in some kind of virtual world, usually very ill specified what that means. But this attracts a lot of people because people know that real estate's a good investment in real life, that if you can buy land in a popular city and you know it's going to grow, then that's only going to go up in value. And so people imagine that that's going to happen in the metaverse. And without going into too many details, the basic summary there is that this is nothing new. We've seen basically virtual housing crises, so to speak, in MMOs way before crypto existed. It's happened in Ultima Online. It's happened in Final Fantasy XIV. It happened in EVE Online. And some of them have been able to solve it with good policy choices. It is a classic trap to pre-sell a bunch of virtual real estate and then make real estate really, really, really important in your game for a lot of reasons we can get into later. But yeah, I would think that's a good summary. And another thing you touched on is that a lot of games have been copying Axie Infinity, at least up until the recent crash in crypto winter. I have been sitting on a lot of conversations behind the scenes, a lot of private consulting, and a lot of fundraising and pitch deals. And you can just see just the outlines of Axie Infinity just like stamped like a template on like every crypto game pitch. Because I really feel like a lot of people really haven't discovered the best practices of this space, assuming there even are any. And so the first person to have big growth, everyone just kind of like copy pasted that white paper and template out. And so like you would see investors that would be like, okay, so what's your breeding system? What's your land gameplay, right? And then the same with all the yield guilds, started copying each other's strategy. And so this made everything super correlated, right? So instead of everyone trying something different, everyone kind of tried the same thing and it all went down at once.
I guess another interesting aspect of this like whole Web3 stuff is that there are so many interesting buzzwords that I have heard lately. Like you just told me a new one, like the crypto winter.
Yeah. So sorry about that. Yeah. So that just means a downturn in the market. Yeah. And it comes from the term AI winter, because AI is this field that, going back to the 50s, right? We're supposed to have thinking robots any day now. And it would go through like a decades-long period where basically there was little investment and everyone kind of gave up on it for a while.
Right.
And so people have reused that term for crypto whenever there's periods of downturns in crypto.
We have kind of talked about the core takeaways from the huge analysis that you did. And also you said you are going to follow up with that a second report. So how about let's jump right into the details that we have just touched on briefly. So one aspect is that there are so many NFT games or crypto games that have a scholarship program, right? So player-formed guilds that have scholarships or like sponsorships like outside of the game to provide the scholars and all that stuff. So I guess let's very quickly clarify or define what are scholars and what are the main issues that you see with systems like scholars.
So this system kind of was created organically. It showed up first, I believe, in Axie Infinity. It might have had precedent before then, but I'm pretty sure it showed up originally under this form in Axie Infinity because there was a sudden demand for the Axies, and so their prices skyrocketed to like literally hundreds of dollars each. And you needed 3 to play. So it could cost almost $1,000 just to be able to play the game. And so this creates a huge barrier to entry. And so just as like credit markets, almost no one can buy a house or a car in cash, right? So they always finance it. Similar thing developed with Axies, and this was the scholarship programs, was it's like, okay, you cannot afford 3 Axies, but you can find a sponsor or a manager who has some, and they will loan them to you. And in exchange, you will kick them back a portion of your earning. Some take 30%, others take 50% is more the kind of going rate. That was kind of their way around it. So it's like nothing up front, but you kick up your earnings. And this was kind of a mutually beneficial arrangement for both parties while the economy was going up. And then now that it's going down, we've seen a lot of those scholars quit. But the major thing is that crypto games have always had a problem with attracting large numbers of users. Like most of them have basically embarrassingly small daily active user counts when you compare them to conventional games. And Axie Infinity got legitimately impressive stats for any game. Like it got millions of players and they had incredible retention. And everyone was so impressed and they judged it by the standard of a conventional game. But the problem is most of their players were scholars. And most of those players were only playing because they were literally being paid to play the game as their job. And so you're really looking at the retention graph of a job, and you should be judging it by that standard rather than by the standard of a game that someone is paying you for the privilege of playing. And that was kind of one of the challenges with the scholarship model, is that it tricked everybody's analysis because they were interpreting the metrics according to what they would assume, like stats you would see in like World of Warcraft. And they would be like, oh, if this is an up-and-coming MMO, like, these are pretty good stats. Or if this is an up-and-coming free-to-play game, this is pretty good stats. And so that was one issue. And then the other issue is that also now those prices for Axies have really plunged. So the managers who are buying those Axies, like they've lost a lot of the value of the principal of those Axies now that the value of each Axie has dropped so largely. And then the other thing we really detailed in our report was that we tracked for every matchmaking ranking of all the scholars what their daily earnings rate was and how it compared to the average Philippine wage and the minimum Philippine wage. And back in the heady days of July, like people were making like 30, 50 bucks a day. Like, I mean, that's pretty good even in America, right? But that was very, very briefly. And nowadays, top players are making like 50, 60 cents a day. And if you've got a manager, you're kicking them half of that. And, if you're kind of like average and you've got a manager making maybe like 20, 15 cents. And if you're below average, you're making like 5 cents. And that's another aspect to this, is that because your earnings is dependent on your matchmaking ranking, as the game goes down, once it starts to decline, it keeps declining because all the lowest earning players, they're the ones whose earnings collapse first and then they leave. Well, what happens to your matchmaking ranking when all the easy players leave? Now you're just up against the more elite people and your matchmaking ranking goes down too. There's all these brutal effects just kick in on the downslope, and that's just one of them. And then the value of those Axies that people paid hundreds of dollars for collapses. Scholars who graduated who were like, oh, I can finally take my earnings and buy my own Axies. That was probably a big mistake for anyone who did that, because if they spent, a couple of months buying Axies there with their own earnings so that they could have independence, it's like the value of that investment is basically evaporated.
Got it. So when the game was like popular, the retention that you saw is basically the retention of a job. So now that average earnings have plummeted for Axies, do you still see that long-term retention happening in Axie right now?
Well, so the thing is, I'm kind of dependent on Sky Mavis for certain metrics. And so while they had excellent retention, they were super happy to brag about it. And they posted all these like fine detailed retention graphs. And then they're still posting daily active users, which is good for them. If they stopped posting them all of a sudden, we would know what was happening, because they would have something to hide. They haven't posted any retention graphs that I've been able to find. But we know that retention has to be slipping because the DAUs are just down. And every other metric we can see is down too. Traffic to their website is down, volume's down, every metric that correlates with gross is down. So we can only assume, even though I can't see a retention graph directly that they posted, that retention must be down too. Mm-hmm. And we also see a bunch of anecdotal stuff about people, like polls on the subreddit. They're saying that like, yeah, I quit and my scholars are quitting and things like that because I was only playing this game for money. But unless someone goes down to the Philippines and takes a broad-based survey, you would mostly only know that stuff indirectly.
Got it. So now that the Axie Origin, the free-to-play counterpart is live, I think for a couple of months now, In your research before, you speculated this free-to-play version is they're just trying to use it as the traditional free-to-play revenue, or maybe they're trying to use this as a launch pad to divert a percentage of the free-to-play player into the play-to-earn version. What are your thoughts or your observations after the launch of Axie Origin?
Right, that's great. Yeah, so Axie Origin is a new game that is meant to be more accessible than Axie Infinity. And so at the time we wrote the last report, we knew Origin was coming, but details were still sketchy. And so basically there were two possibilities, right? They could just make a branded game in their ecosystem that was totally free to play and crypto free, or they could make it a kind of gateway drug and have some crypto-based features in there to kind of like get you into the more crypto version of the game. And it looks like they've taken that latter path. I've played Axie Origin. Its main innovation is that you don't need NFT Axies to play. There are non-NFT Axies you can play with, so-called free Axies. They're not as good and you can't earn money with them, but you can at least get started. I mean, that makes sense if you want a game that's a little easier to onboard. One of the challenges with it is that we can see from some slides from a presentation they gave at, ETH CC4, I think. I forget the exact name of the conference, but it was an Ethereum blockchain conference, where COO Alexander Larson does a presentation and he talks about Axie Origin. And he has a slide where he specifically says, we want to be able to launch this game on Steam and on Google Play and on the Apple App Store. Mm-hmm. And that has not happened. They've basically been cut off of distribution because these major platforms are not welcoming to crypto games. For better or for worse, whether you think they should be or not, the point is that they're not. And that makes you very vulnerable when you need that distribution. And what we've seen from the figures is that we mostly do not see any evidence that there's a lot of uptake with Axie Origin. And there's certain ways to interpret this. One could be, it's like, okay, well, when Axie Origin comes out of alpha, that's when we'll see the growth, right? And I'm a little skeptical of that for a couple of reasons. Because one thing is, in Axie Origin, there's currently no way to earn in Axie Origin. That comes once alpha is done. During the alpha, it's still quite playable, So if you were just there for fun, you can have fun with Axie Origin now. Yeah, it's an alpha game, but I mean, the original game was largely in long alpha periods too, and it didn't have too many problems getting users. And so I think if basically the argument is that, well, only when the crypto gaming comes online will people come to play, that kind of invalidates the thesis that a bunch of people are going to come and play for fun and maybe be trained to put in more money than they take out. It kind of seems to validate the thesis that most people who play Axie play for money, and that the people who are there just for its own intrinsic experience are a very small part of the population. And that's, I think, the challenge that Axie Origin has. It's very, very similar to the original game. It's got better art, and it's got some more additional elements with like charms and runes, which, I mean, some people are cynically kind of referring to that as pay to win. It basically is like progression, and they're kind of money sinks. I understand why they put them in there, but it does increase kind of the payment barrier or the time barrier you need to put in to advance in the game. Just like plenty of other mobile games, right? Mm-hmm. But I think the greatest challenge here is that they're cut off from conventional distribution. Their growth is clearly negative. And I think their growth back in July, when they were getting millions of users, I think has kind of screwed up their intuitions, and they're not fully prepared for how hard it actually is to acquire users when you're not paying them. And to recruit and retain and get the users to pay you, I think is something that they're not fully prepared for. And I think Axie Origin is showing us that the users mostly aren't showing up so far. When it comes out of alpha, maybe something will change, but I'm kind of doubtful.
Got it. We kind of like went through the non-land gameplay part of Axie so far. And so I guess it's time to look at another big issue, which is land gameplay. Land system is not just, a big part of Axie's future. It's also like the central part of many, many other crypto games. The Sandbox, Earth 2, Decentraland, all that stuff. I also have happened to play, two MMORPGs that has very prominent land gameplay, which is Ultima Online. I have been playing Ultima Online since the Second Age, and also Star Wars Galaxies. And then those have nothing to do with crypto, right? So, and they have a lot of land system related issues. I guess a few things to set up just baselines for our audience is that what are the so-called land-like assets and what properties do they have?
Right. So talking about the whole land stuff. So just a real quick line about Axie Infinity. They have a planned land gameplay system that's not released yet. It's not part of Axie Origin. It's a separate game. It's not out yet. We'll talk about that in a bit.
Yeah.
But as you mentioned, land and virtual real estate is not new. It's old. It's been around decades. What all these games have in common is what you have referred to as land-like assets. And so a land-like asset is any asset that has three properties. And the three properties are numero uno, it needs to be scarce, right? There needs to be only so many of them. And there needs to basically be published plans that say you're not going to have any more than this amount. That's what we mean by scarce in this context. Two, it needs to be something that's necessary for production is how you say it in econ terms. But in gameplay terms, you can say it's basically something that is required. Something, if you want to participate meaningfully in certain parts of the game, you need to have it. And that can mean like, if you want to have housing in the game, you need a land plot. Or it can be like, the only place you can ever get gold is from veins of gold that are on certain plots of land. So whether it's resources or access to a feature or a service, that's what we mean by necessary for production, so to speak, or gameplay. And then third, it needs to obtain value based off of its location. So like one aspect of land is not just that it's like valuable dirt, but also that it's a valuable location. Like regardless of how nice the land itself is physically, the fact that it is where it is more valuable than if it were somewhere else. If you had some land where you could put a house and it's right next to the big city, that's really valuable, especially if travel is physically embodied in the game. If you can't instantly warp anywhere you want in the game, then just being closer to things you already want to go to is more valuable when it comes to land. And so those are the three properties. And the significance of this, and then I'll kick this back to you, is that whenever you have an asset that has those three properties, that it's scarce, that it's necessary for production, and that it obtains value from its location, this creates some unique economic properties for that asset. One, it becomes extremely attractive to speculators because it's the perfect asset to corner and scalp. Because if you own that asset and you know the population of the game is going to grow, there's a scarce amount of it and everybody needs it, which means that demand for it is basically guaranteed to go up so long as the population goes up. And so you should go ahead and get that. And then third, because it obtains value from its location, you can gain value without doing anything because people will want to acquire land in order to do things with it. And so you don't necessarily need to do something. In fact, if other people do stuff on their land next to yours, the value of your land will go up. And so it just produces this perfect speculative incentive to get it, to hold it out of use, to not do anything with it. And it creates the same problems we see in real life with land speculation in big cities. And it's kind of fascinating, actually, from an economic modeling perspective, how it basically speed runs the housing crisis in these games. And of course, the catch is it's only a good investment if the population goes up. If you speculate so hard that the population goes down, well, then the joke's on you. There's also some unique aspects in video games in particular. So first of all, in the real world, there's only one Taipei. There's only one Manhattan. There's only one Austin. In video games, nothing stops your competitors from making an entirely new virtual world. So yes, land can be scarce in the sense that you've decided to make land in your world scarce, but there's no shortage of other new virtual worlds for people to go to. And so that's something a lot of people forget is it's like, okay, land in the Sandbox might be scarce, but like, or Earth 2, but there's an Earth 3 and an Earth 4 and an Earth 5 just down the street. There's that aspect of it's like, okay, why should I buy prime real estate in your universe? But the other aspect is a lot of these games are actually user-generated content games. Mm-hmm. Roblox is the perfect example of a user-generated content game where it's like, okay, the players make the content. YouTube is user-generated content, right? People make content, the platform hosts it and shares it with everybody, and the content creators can get paid, right? But the model that we see in the Sandbox and also that Axie has planned for its land gameplay is that you need to own land in order to deploy content, which means there's all these like this entire class of landlords who don't really intend to be content creators themselves, but they're definitely going to charge you rent to deploy content on their platform, which is just like sets up this whole like layer of middlemen. And so you're not allocating basically the discovery slots on your platform to creative individuals. You're just allocating it to passive speculators. And so for a UGC platform, usually UGC platforms go out and like pay content creators to bootstrap themselves and give them tons of visibility and access. But here, anyone creating content on that platform is going to be paying rent to a virtual landlord, which seems really kind of strange and bizarre and sort of backwards.
I think this is a big pain point for people who are living in places or like cities which have a real housing crisis already. And then it's hard to imagine, like, if they're having this issue in real life already, why would they want to duplicate or even like a more severe version of that in video games? Depending on which report you read, right? It's like, because you also mentioned Taipei. Taipei is actually being ranked as around the number 4 or the number 7 city that in the world have a housing crisis right now. So we personally know that the housing crisis can cause real issues. And I don't know if this issue is something that you want to have in your video games.
Well, what's interesting, especially about Taiwan is, and Taipei, is your own history. This isn't the first time y'all have grappled with this. I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong about Taiwanese history here. But Taiwan is very famous now for being one of the Asian tigers, for having this huge economic miracle. And the first part of that, achieving that economic miracle, was land reform. I believe it was Sun Yat-sen, who was inspired by the works of the economist Henry George, who helped bring about a land reform program in Taiwan called Land to the Tiller, which was just take the land away from the landlords. I think at the time, a couple of families owned most of the land. I think there was still the legacy of like the colonial Japanese and things like that. And the land was distributed basically to whatever peasant was currently working that land. And as soon as they did that, it massively dealt with economic inequality, and productivity of all those parcels of land went way up. Previously, if you were to improve the land as a tenant, that was just a signal to your landlord to increase your rent. So why bother, right? Why work twice as hard to get paid exactly as much? But now it was like, you improve your land, you keep it. So that land reform was a major boon to modern Taiwanese, made Taiwan what it is today, that and a bunch of other reforms. A lot of modern economists say the kind of downside to land reform, I mean, it's perfectly good policy, but eventually the land ownership reconcentrates. And so it's not a permanent solution. And so you do eventually get urban cities that have housing crises. I mean, it's not just Taipei, it's New York City, it's Austin, Texas, it's San Francisco, California, all over the world. It's Oslo, Norway, right? Mm-hmm. There are some suggestions that Henry George's land value tax is kind of a policy solution that can fix this. And what's interesting is we have seen that policy enacted in a video game. And that video game is EVE Online, because EVE Online had a housing crisis right when it started. And so what's interesting is we go back to this land-like asset, right? A land-like asset doesn't literally have to be called land in the game. It just needs to be anything that's scarce, necessary for production, and obtains value from location. And in EVE, these were starship factories. Now, starship factories in the real world are capital because we can make more of them. But in EVE, they were like fixed. They were created only by the developer, and there were only so many of them, and no one could make any more. So they might as well have been like land or planets or anything in terms of scarcity. And so people speculated on them. They would buy them, and then they would charge rent to access them through a black market. And so no one could produce any spaceships, and spaceship costs went way up. And so EVE Online, they hired an economist by the name of Ramin Shahrazadeh, and he came in and he had no knowledge of Henry George's land value tax whatsoever. He just looked at the problem and he re-derived the same solution from first principles and was like, what you need to do is you need to apply a high holding fee to these factories so that only people who actually want to use them to build ships will do that. And otherwise there'll be a hot potato effect. They'll sell it to someone who will. It fixed the problem. It fixed the speculation issue. And EVE was able to have a successful launch. I've actually written a policy paper with Daniel Cook about applying digital land value tax for virtual worlds and MMOs. Like, my advice is just don't recreate the problems of the real world if you can. But if you find yourself there anyway, you might consider enacting some of these economic policies that have been proven to work in the real world, such as land reform or land value taxes. Please correct me if I got any of that history wrong, by the way.
Yeah, I think this is correct because this is what we have been learning in Taiwanese history, in our elementary school or middle school. So yeah, that's definitely one part of one of the important reasons why Taiwan's economic boom that happened, in the 50s, 60s or something like that.
Yeah, there's this book called How Asia Works that talks about the rise of the Asian tigers. And I think everyone that has boomed like that, the first step has always been land reform.
Yeah.
So I think it's not a coincidence.
So one interesting thing to continue this land system discussion is that since you have talked about the Sandbox, right? The Sandbox has this issue where the UGC system is basically gated by those landowners. And you also see they publish tools like Vox Edit and other, easier game developer tools for the purpose of user content generation on the Sandbox. So do you really see much activity in this regard, like on the Sandbox?
So we wrote a report at Naavik on the Sandbox as well. That was a couple of months ago. So I haven't followed up lately, especially not since the crypto crash.
Right.
I can say that Vox Edit is a pretty impressive tool in terms of just being a voxel art tool. Like, it's actually pretty impressive. The challenge for the Sandbox is, at least at the time I reviewed it, I didn't see a lot of activity, certainly not a lot of users. One of the challenges is also these platforms will often rely on low code, what we call low code or no code solutions. And so these are basically like drag and drop editing interfaces, or like things where you can like set a couple behaviors, but it's not like you can just make a game in Unity or C++ or JavaScript or whatever, like in a real programming language, and then just compile against their SDK or their API or whatever. Like, you kind of have to ride this little tricycle with training wheels. And it's a common problem, I think, like, apart from all the other problems we've discussed, like land or crypto or anything, just when you're a new UGC platform, I think a lot of people are like, oh, well, we want to make it easy for people who don't have a lot of expertise to build content for us. And I think that's fine to do, but you also really, really, really want to attract professionals. You need a killer app. And to increase your chance of getting a killer app, you need to convince some pros to come, and you need to give them some real power tools. For all the complaints people have about Unity, I mean, that's got like, what, over a decade worth of just time and experience and little details just like ironed into it, And so when you come to some editing suite that has maybe 2 years of dev time in it, and very little like live shipped time, it's just really hard to attract that professional content. And this has kind of been Roblox's problem traditionally. They're now starting to finally get past it, just because Roblox is so old and their editing tools have had so much time to mature. But early on, like, they had all these problems with people like butting up against the limits of Roblox. And it was only the fact that Roblox had basically no competition that gave them time to mature their tools like that. And so I really think putting training wheels on your tools is not necessarily the best way to attract professional development, especially if you also aren't giving out generous development incentives, because getting users to play your thing is hard. Getting users to come and produce content that will attract users to play is super hard when there are so many other options. Like, that might have been viable in 2005 or 2010, but there are so many UGC platforms right now that are all vying for people's attentions, even within this space, right? I mean, one of the challenges Axie is up against is that by the time their land gameplay finally launches, by the time their SDK already launches, there's going to be 10 other projects. So even if we accept, for the sake of argument, that it's possible to do something interesting in crypto, why this game? Like, why this one needs to be the question that every project is asking itself.
Okay, so in terms of land gameplay, there's another interesting aspect to think about, is that let's just assume that if you still want to make a blockchain game or like a NFT game, if a NFT game or play to earn game, if they started the project with a land system in their game, what would be a reasonable, like, nice to have land system that don't kind of like cause so much of housing crisis?
Right. So the thing is, if you have a game that has a physical persistent world, it's actually kind of hard to avoid some of the aspects of the land problem. because wherever people gather, those locations will become more valuable, right? And you don't even necessarily need to have land ownership officially. Like in Star Wars Galaxies, like Raph Koster, the lead designer, told me a problem that they had was people could build like player-built cities. And so they could abuse these in ways by like finding a dungeon with a lot of good resources in it and put a city over it. And they weren't meant to be able to do that, but now they basically could gatekeep access to that dungeon and force you to pay tolls. And they didn't expect people to be able to do that. And so even without necessarily like a formal, like I own this plot system, people can basically like take possession of land. Like in Ultima Online, like just a gang could just set up in a forest and be like, we own this forest, right? So a nice land system, like any land system, really has to grapple with the fact that it can be enclosed and it can be used as a system to extract value from other people, because the most valuable places are where everyone wants to go. And so I think, number one, don't pre-sell land. Especially don't pre-sell land for years before your land gameplay releases or is even designed, frankly, because you will just set yourself up for a revolt from your landowners when your game finally ships. Because you're going to have to choose between, well, do I want anyone to actually play this game, or do I want to keep my landowners happy, right? It's an impossible situation. Just don't get into it in the first place. But number two, I think I wrote this policy paper. We outlined a couple of solutions. One is you can impose a digital land value tax policy, where basically you collect what we call the land rent, which you could think of as the land income. And this is the value of the land, what people are willing to pay to rent the land without any buildings or improvements on top of it, right? Basically the value of being at that location. You charge that as a recurring fee. And if you do that, then we've seen from the example of Eve and economic theory and tests in the real world, that basically fixes your economy. That it kills the incentive of anyone to speculate, and it actually brings the price to buy the land down, because the price of the land is however much income it can generate from rents times years times how patient I am, right? And so it actually makes the land more affordable. And we have a couple of policies that describe how you can go about doing this. But one thing that makes it easier for you in video games that we can't do in real life is that you can take buildings off of land and just like stick them in your pocket in your inventory. That makes it real easy to calculate the value of land separately from buildings, because you can take bids on them separately. If you have a system to buy or rent land and buildings, someone in real life, someone wants to buy my house, they have to like buy my house and the land it's on. But in your game, someone can be like, oh, I like your house or I like your land, and you can generate bids for them separately. My paper goes into a bunch of details, but basically there's solutions to this problem. A very common thing is you can just make enough land for everybody. You can do instancing. There's trade-offs for that. You get less of a sense of like presence. You know, it's like everyone's kind of playing their own single-player game that's attached to a multiplayer game. Mm-hmm. But it does work, and it is a safety valve. But I would just say, just be really careful when you sell people things. Just being aware of the long-term effects of that. The other problem with land gameplay is not so much related necessarily to land economics, but just in terms of structure. And this ties back to NFTs as well. Bored Ape Yacht Club is a good example of this. There's this premise of, I'm going to sell you an NFT, whether it's land or a Bored Ape, that's a ticket to the metaverse, right? And the problem with this is, in real life yacht clubs charge a recurring membership fee. Real life country clubs, exclusive clubs, members clubs, they all charge recurring membership fees. Why? Because they're providing you with recurring services. And so this whole idea of, it's like you spent $3,000 for an NFT, and now somehow you're entitled to the VIP treatment across all of the blockchain universe somehow, and especially a bunch of third parties are supposed to develop it too and like cater to all the Bored Ape holders. It's like the incentives just are not there to build that. And so it's just a business model proposition. Don't charge a single one-time upfront fee and then put yourself on the hook for recurring services. Just charge a subscription if you're going to run a club.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very, very fair point. The next question I think we haven't really talked about in terms of like Web3 and digital asset ownership is that the concept of governance, right? So you own some asset or some tokens in this ecosystem, and then somehow you are supposed to be able to govern it with other people that is like they have a stake in this world, right? This may go back to Axie a little bit. So far, one of the more extreme adjustments that Sky Mavis did to Axie was they can adjust the SLP income. This obviously have a huge impact on people who have bought into this system before they made the adjustments, right? So when we generalize the situations like this in terms of GameFi systems, and also like in terms of like eventual idea of decentralized governance, because they're talking about DAOs and whatever. How would this even work when they're the gods of the world and they can adjust the rules based on how they see fit?
This is a classic issue of the Oracle problem, right? The Oracle and the Oracle problem originally comes from like, say you've got a stable coin and you need to know what the price of $1 is, right? The blockchain doesn't know. You call out to some API that tells you what the price of $1 is, and then you do your stuff. And that's called an oracle, is something outside the blockchain. Well, here the oracle is Sky Mavis. And the blockchain is like, you can conduct a secure vote of everyone who owns an AXS token. That's the Axie Infinity Shard, the Axie Universe's governance token. So everyone who owns that is supposed to be able to eventually have a vote. Now, they're going to progressively decentralize, like they haven't handed over control yet. But even supposing they had, how do you enforce that vote? You can conduct a vote on the blockchain and see what the results are, and like nobody can cheat. But then how do you enforce that will? Like in the United States, when there's an executive order or a law is passed or the Supreme Court makes a ruling, there are men with guns that will go out and make sure that that is the law, right? You go out in America and try to sell drugs on the street, and men with guns will come and stop you. They're called police. I mean, the libertarians kind of get credit for this, that like, the government has a monopoly on violence, right? And that is how they get to make the law have teeth, is that if you don't follow the law, men with guns will put you in jail. How do we therefore get people to do what we want in the world of the blockchain, right? And I think this is mostly an unsolved problem. I think there's one possible route, which is power of the purse. So like if you have money tied up on a smart contract on the blockchain, you could like make Sky Mavis do something they didn't want to do by basically withholding milestone payments. The governance DAO basically employs the game developer. And then if the game developer wants some money, they need to do what the governance board said. And I'm not sure we've really seen that tested in theory yet. I'm not sure. I mean, maybe someone's already done that. I haven't really heard of that being done in the wild yet. I would like to see it if it has. But that's kind of all a moot point because we're not even there yet for most of these games. They've all agreed to do progressive decentralization, which means they start out 100% centralized, and then they're going to move towards being 100% decentralized later. And what I've observed is like that always happens in the future, and the future never quite gets here. And maybe they all intend to do so, but I mean, it's hard to get people to give up power, especially when they've come into a lot of money. And a question is whether enough of these projects will survive long enough to make it to decentralization. But I think when you have these controversial decisions, and the premise was that it's like all the branding is about how we own it and players own it, and it's the first player owned, and that's all BS until you bite that bullet and deliver on that promise, and you hold governance votes and you abide by the results. I think one thing a lot of people don't necessarily realize is that the contours of progressive decentralization is an artifact of our current legal system, right? Because why don't these games just give out shares on the blockchain? Why can't you just get a share of Axie Infinity that entitles you to dividends? Like just a share of Sky Mavis on the blockchain. Why don't we have that? Because there's laws against that. There's laws against money emissions in the United States, where basically you're acting as a bank. And there's laws against any token that looks too much like a security, like a financial instrument, a share. And so progressive decentralization, and don't quote me on this because I'm not a lawyer, but I've talked to some lawyers, and my understanding as a layperson is that it is a particular legal strategy to achieve the closest thing you can kind of get to that without crossing the line, so that you can basically be like, we will decentralize eventually, and we're just going to put this token on the blockchain. We're not a bank. We're not emitting it. It's just on the blockchain, and we have some and you have some. And then eventually it's going to control our organization, but that's going to happen gradually. So there's never this moment where, yes, it's definitely a security. But if regulations come in, that could change any time. And so my interpretation is that progressive decentralization always seems to happen like tomorrow and never today. And then I also think that particular structure is an artifact of securities law to kind of route around it. If we had different securities law, we might have a different strategy. Anyway, I would be very excited to see someone bite that bullet and just be like, okay, we need to do this unpopular decision. The players were like, no. They're like, well, I guess we won't do it. I would love to see that happen and just to see what happens as a consequence.
Okay, got it. We are starting to winding down into conclusions. So I think one of the main takeaway that I got from the report and also this discussion is that despite all the effort that game developers put into their tokenomics, so to speak, there are tokenomics with more tokens. There are 3 token models, or even like more token models. But still, I can't help but think that most GameFi games will run into the situation that basically your research already concluded is that the revenue will be driven by the pace of new player additions. If you stop to having new players joining in, then basically your economics collapse. They are not really driven by the current total player numbers. It's like you have to have that speed. The underlying reasoning for that, from my understanding, is that the people will expect to extract value from the system rather than putting in. So either way, no matter how hard you design your tokenomics around that, it's always going to collapse. So what are your conclusions or thoughts about this?
Well, so what I think is that a lot of people have just gotten into tokenomic astrology, where, basically there's this just belief that if you can make the snake eat its own tail enough and you can have these burn mechanic, like everyone in Axie is obsessed with burn mechanics, right? If only we had burn mechanics for SLP, if only we had burn mechanics for Axies, that would reduce the supply of those, that would increase the price. Well, everyone is hoping that everybody else will burn their SLP and their Axies so that the people who are holding on them can see an increased price. But the problem is you can't get someone to burn something unless you give them an incentive to do so. So if you're going to give them goodies in exchange for them burning something, well, then those goodies have to have enough value to make you willing to do it. The bottom line is there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? And your actual sustainable economies are actually pretty simple. You provide an intrinsic value. Hey, this is a movie theater. You come watch a movie, you pay me a ticket, you come eat some popcorn, you pay me money for that, and you leave happy. You gave me money in exchange for something you thought was as valuable or more valuable than that money. End of story. And then maybe one of you was a movie critic and you wrote a review of that movie, and so your employer paid you money for it. You can't make a perfectly circular economy that just eats itself. Like, you have to have some input. And in the earth itself, that input is the sun that gives us constant energy in the form of either, oil from millions of years ago or solar energy and wind energy today, and makes our crops grow and everything. We're constantly getting that new injection of energy, and every economy is the same way. You can't just tokenize your way out of it. One thing you can do with your tokenomics is not make your life super difficult by making one token have 10 jobs, so you can balance your tokens individually. But if you have 10 tokens, honestly, I think you need to not plan your tokenomics first and just plan your business model first of what is the value you're providing, who are you providing it to, and why are they going to give you money for it? And that's that. I think too many people have attracted an entire audience that's just interested in how they're going to get paid, and you're kind of doomed. You just need to Ponzi yourself up if you're going to go with that strategy.
Right. You touch on a very important aspect, is that people have to provide value in expectation of getting returns. So I guess one interesting thing to talk about is a lot of pre-crypto MMOs that have secondary markets, right? So they don't use cryptos and they don't use NFTs, but players created values for other players, and then some other players are willing to pay money for those second-hand market values.
Yes.
So do you see this as a viable strategy for the crypto games?
Yeah, so it's interesting. A lot of those secondary markets, you have to realize, are a small slice of the whole economy. Let me give you a good example. Destiny 2. If you want to hire a mercenary to come carry you in Destiny 2, you can. But the demand for that is caused by someone wanting to play Destiny 2 and wanting to play Destiny 2 enough to want to pay someone to help them get through a hard boss or whatever. There's probably, I don't have evidence of this, but I'm sure the same thing happens in Elden Ring or whatever, that there's some network you can connect to hire somebody. I mean, it's easy enough to get just random summons to come in, but these kind of things have been around forever. There's a super convoluted system dating all the way back to Diablo 2, where there's a special little forum where you can have people come into your game and exchange assets for you and put points on your forum account that you can then trade for stuff in other games, right? But those secondary economies have always been kind of a minor aspect to the game, and they're dependent on intrinsic value existing in the game first. And the best example of where this can go wrong is when you make markets too efficient, it's sometimes you can make them a lot less fun as a game, right? Diablo 3's Auction House was a really good example of this, is that Diablo 3's whole game is about the kind of drip of loot drops. And so the thing is, though, there's enough obsessive people in the world that have grinded for hours to get some sort of ultra death. That would have been a really rare or difficult drop for me to get, but now I can pay 5 cents for it. So why should I ever put any amount of time ever into anything else I can achieve in Diablo 3 when I can just pay 5 cents or $5 for that, right? Dan Cook, he designed a game called at Spry Fox called Realm of the Mad God. And in this game, one of the things they intentionally tried to do was to avoid making their markets and their bazaars too efficient, so that you had to go and like wheel and deal and find the guy who was your good hookup for green potions. You know, Ultima Online was kind of the same way. And the inefficiency of those markets is where kind of some of the fun came from. If you make them too efficient, then, you know, basically bots and algorithms kind of rule the day. And I mean, that's really great if I want to get something for 32 cents on Amazon, but it's not necessarily super fun in a game. I think you just have to acknowledge that those things have to be secondary parts of your game and not the primary focus.
Got it. So what kind of examples have you seen in the Web3 or crypto world that are not entirely dependent on new players' additions?
Yeah, I've seen a couple. So first of all, the problem we're talking about is specifically, like, we built a model in our last Novik paper about Axie that showed that even if we assumed their growth would continue, if the growth just slowed down, that was enough to start making their revenue decrease. Because most games monetize a base of users. So even if their user base is stable or even declining a little, they can still make a lot of money because they're like making money continuously off of the number of users. But Axie was monetizing growth itself, which is super dangerous. You make tons of money on the upswing, and then it just all of a sudden stops if it even slows down. And it hasn't slowed down, it has declined. But you asked games that don't do that. And there are some crypto games that don't do that. And there are 3 I'll talk about super briefly. The first is Zedrun and all of the Zedrun alikes, which is like a horse racing game. Then there is Sunflower Farmers, I think has already been replaced by a new game, which is this weird kind of co-op sort of model. And then there's games like Dark Forest or Conquest that are kind of like not really in it for the money at all. So going to the first one, Zedrun is just like a horse, basically gambling game, where it's just a virtual horse track, and there's 12 horses that run, and number 1, number 2, and number 3 will get money, and everyone else, like everyone pays into the race, and then 3 people walk off with money. Mm-hmm. So that's sustainable because more money goes in than goes out. But it's basically just gambling. But like, I mean, gambling is as old as human history, and it's quote unquote sustainable, right? Like the casino is sustainable. You might not be sustainable very, very long if you keep going there. So it works. Whether it's good or good for the world is another question. That's one kind of thing. And I'm not super excited about that. Then there is Sunflower Farmers was weird. It had some problems where basically it got botted and it congested the entire Polygon blockchain, which is another story. But it was generally like weird and very interesting because it was basically a standard kind of idle game, kind of like Farmville, where it's like, okay, you set this up, you're going to like grow some strawberries. That's going to take a long time, and then you can harvest them later. So you got to like check back in. Basically, the way it worked was like, okay, if you want to wait for those strawberries, you have to like check in and you have to just wait. So you're paying with time. Or you could buy a token, the game's token off of the blockchain. I think it was like sunflower tokens. And you could buy it right now, right? And if you paid with time, you would eventually start generating sunflower tokens. So basically, if you pay with time, you're rewarded eventually with money that comes from other players. And if you pay with money, you are purchasing time from other players, effectively. And it was truly decentralized. Like, the developers weren't centralized in the center, like taking cut of it. And actually, Sunflower Farmers, I think it was a fully on-chain game somehow, which was really quite impressive. And it was just kind of run as a co-op. So it's basically like people are playing this idle game, and they're just trading time and money between each other. And so it wasn't super interesting from a game design perspective, but it was kind of interesting from that setup and that it was like legit about the decentralized co-op thing. No one was making billions off of it. And then the thing that was its downfall, of course, was that it got botted to heck and bots just tried to extract all the value. But it was academically interesting, and I think it's worth mentioning. And then you have games like Dark Forest, which are fully on-chain, and they're not really interested in the money aspect so much as just like making this very simple kind of 4X space game with Fog of War fully on-chain. It's really interesting. It's really weird. It's not super sophisticated, and I'm not sure if it'll ever blow up and get exciting, but I mean, it works. I'm not sure if that's the best way to make that kind of game, but I mean, it works. And so those are the kind of things I've seen that don't do the thing that Axie does. Maybe there'll be other models that appear. Those are the ones I've seen so far.
I see. If someone in the audience is really into like crypto games or something like that, they can actually find inspirations from places other than Axie or like the Sandbox. As you mentioned, you talked to developers like Dan Cook and Ralph Koster. Also, there was a GDC talk in 2019. The talk was made by Alex Jaffe. His talk was Curse Problems in Game Design. And,
oh yeah, excellent talk.
Yeah, so the gist of the talk is basically trying to have this intuition to distinguish hard problems versus cursed problems. So also like Dan Cook and Ralph Koster also talks, concepts like this, like what actual problems are you trying to solve, or are you trying to burden yourself with something that you cannot solve? So it's really interesting to talk about this because I don't think people really understand when they are going into Web3 and crypto, what problems are they trying to solve with this technology or this ecosystem? So what are your observations so far?
Right. So Alex Jaffe's talk, I recommend everyone go out and look it up. I think it's free on YouTube. Yeah. So the whole notion between a hard problem and a cursed problem is a cursed problem is one you cannot solve. You cannot innovate your way out of it. And there's a kind of really optimistic tech person that hears that and just sees it as a challenge. And I warn these people to learn a little bit about mathematical theory, because what's great about Alex Jaffe is he's a mathematician. And so he's like, there's actually provably impossible problems. And if you want to not make your life miserable, you need to develop intuitions about when you're trying to solve something that literally can't be solved and whether you even need to, right? And so my main critique of blockchain is that a lot of things people try to do with blockchain gaming are curse problems. And a good example of one that Alex Jaffe talks about in regular game design is, imagine Street Fighter. Street Fighter is a super fun game. It's all about combat mastery. Now let's do it with 4 people at once, like Smash Brothers or any multiplayer fighting game. The problem is when you have 2 goals that are incompatible. So in Street Fighter, you're like, I want to play to win, and I also want to play to master combat, right? That works when you have 2 players. It doesn't when you have 4 altogether, because now playing to win means playing politics. It means don't be the best player at the game so that everyone gangs up on you, and be a sneaky little loser who cheeses at the last. You're right, because you can't have combat mastery and playing to win with more than 2 players, because politics is the way to win. And so you have to sacrifice one or the other, he says. The only way to overcome a cursed problem is to sacrifice one of your goals that are in opposition to one another, and be honest about that. And so Smash Brothers does it by basically adding so much chaos that you can't really play to win. And that's why in all the hardcore tournaments, it's always no items, one-on-one, final destination, right? You just reduce it to Street Fighter. And so to take this to blockchain gaming, I'm not sure if the problem is hard or cursed, but I'm starting to believe it is. First of all, play to earn is just clearly cursed. Like, there's no way to make everybody earn money without just having some billionaire just subsidizing the entire project. But even games where only some people are earning money, I think that's even a cursed problem, because there's this fundamental tension between extrinsic and intrinsic rewards. If like I'm playing a game to earn money, I'm kind of having a worse experience, because now I'm thinking of like, I'm earning what, $2.50 an hour playing this game. That might even be a pretty good rate for a play to earn game. But I think of it's like, instead of doing that, I could work for an actual high paying job that I kind of enjoy and then play games for my own enjoyment on its spare time. There's been all these studies that show that when you ask someone to do something for free, they get a lot more satisfaction out of it than if you like pay them $2 to do it, because then they're like focused on, was that really worth $2? And so I really think that the whole like people earning money to play games is a challenging problem. And anyway, watch the talk. I'm not making any final rulings about what's cursed and what's not, but it's important to realize that you can't innovate your way out of every problem. And I think blockchain, aside from games, is another example of that, is that Bitcoin works. It really, really works, but it pays a very high price in order to work with its proof of work chain, right? Mm-hmm. A very, very, very high price, a price that some say, including me, we shouldn't be paying. But the problem is we've taken the Bitcoin model and been like, well, what else can we use it for? Surely we can use it for something else. And we've compromised away those first two principles of decentralized and trustless in so many ways, but kept irreversibility and then also terrible user experience, because we must use a blockchain for all this stuff. I think we're kind of forgetting that maybe we don't need a blockchain to achieve what we want, especially if we've already compromised away two of the supposed benefits of blockchain. So anyway, I think people should be willing to go back to the drawing board.
Okay, so I think the final touch that we can give this, this whole discussion is that are there real and long-term sustainable use for NFTs in games? Like I'm not talking about other type of NFT usages, because there are so many others. But maybe we can like draw inspirations from other more sensible NFT usages. Like maybe, there's a transferable investable membership like certificate, or other smart contract applications that you can use in video games. And one very interesting concept I have seen in non-games NFTs recently is that there is like this self-improvement gamification kind of NFT businesses. Like, do you think any of those have a chance in terms of games?
What I think is that we should look to the history of the other field that had all these winters, which is AI, artificial intelligence, and really learn from how that field progressed. Because AI has been promised to us for decades, and for a long time, it was a huge disappointment. And now it's made just all this blistering progress in the past 10 years, and it's just delivering all these marvelous miracles to the point that it's now so good that people are afraid that like it might like kill us all because it's too good, right? Kind of like an extreme version of a nice problem to have. Right. Your field making too much progress too quickly. When before it was like nothing good will ever come of this. It's all pointless waste of time, right? And so what's really interesting about that, if you go back and you look at the history of artificial intelligence and how it's developed, artificial intelligence is not a technology. It's a brand name, right? And it's a principle. It's a goal. And the way they got through the AI winters was just giving up when they reached a dead end and trying something else, and not getting hung up on a particular technological implementation or technological solution. So if you go back and you look in like really early AI, everyone's just like, if statements, computer programming. What if we made a lot of if statements? Could intelligence arise from that? And the answer is no. But for a long time, people really thought we were going to get like data from Star Trek from like if statements, like symbolic logic was enough if you just like did enough of it, because isn't that how the human brain works? And it turns out it isn't. And then people tried some new methods, and they were like, okay, let's do this, let's do that. And I won't bore you with like all of them, but like reinforcement learning was kind of like the hotness like 10 years ago. And then that kind of sort of dead ended. And deep learning is the one that has had all of these breakthroughs. That's really grossly oversimplifying it. But the point is, we gave up on all these different technologies, but we kept calling them AI throughout the whole thing. And then eventually, one of them went to the moon and we declared victory without ever admitting failure, even though we gave up a whole bunch of times and started over, right? And I think that is what is going to happen with blockchain. I have this theory called blockchain evaporation, where basically the underlying like obsession with classic blockchain of trustless, decentralized, and immutable, in a lot of these applications, it's going to wither away. In fact, it already has, especially in Axie Infinity, right? It's totally trusted. It's totally centralized anyway. And I think the honest approach is to kind of embrace that, but not in the cynical way that it's usually done, of basically like pitching blockchain and then not delivering it, but just going back to the promises of blockchain and then thinking, how else could we achieve these? And are the trade-offs we're paying right now the right ones we want to pay? Maybe we want to pay other trade-offs to achieve other things. Like irreversibility is more of a problem than it is a solution. Maybe trust is okay. Maybe let's focus instead on making it easy to change who you trust rather than making it so that you don't have to trust anyone. Right now, I trust Google for a bunch of services. If I want to change that, I have no way to do so. I cannot extricate my Google accounts like at a moment's notice. It would be really cool if I could do that. Keep all my stuff, but now I'm trusting these guys instead in 5 seconds. Like that would be a months-long migration for me if I was trying to extricate myself from the Google empire. I can't do it, you know? And so we talk about getting specific about how you apply this to games. So like we really want people to own this game, right? And we're going to do that with a governance token. What if we just make the IP public domain or Creative Commons and we make the code open source, right? There's a game like that. It's really popular. It's called Friday Night Funkin'. I was the technical advisor on it. It has over 4 or 5 billion views on TikTok. That game is just open source and the characters are just kind of like shared and stuff like that. And I'm not sure it's technically actually public domain, but like the Two Who project is another example of a project in that spirit. Basically, people are allowed to make fan games and they're very permissive with it. And it's become this sprawling shared universe, right? That is owned by its fans, but not in the libertarian financial sense, but just in the literal sense that no one owns it, so everybody owns it kind of deal. I mean, still pretty much kind of controlled by the original creator, but he's very, very permissive with it. And I say we could go further and just experiment that way. Maybe that's a dead end. Who knows? There's other things we could try. Like, what if instead of having these cumbersome blockchains that are actually really bad at storing data, we just used regular databases, but made them public read only? Mm-hmm. So it's like, okay, you can connect to this database and this store of data if you like, but you can also connect to that one, and you can connect to that one, and you can see everything. So instead of it being only the developers can see what's in the database, anyone can see it. Maybe that's interesting. Blockchains are built on this technology called Merkle trees, which are a way to basically have a bog standard database, but they can detect if they've been tampered with because every transaction is cryptographically signed, right? It's a primitive that blockchains are built off of. But maybe just going back to just that tool, you could just do interesting things with Merkle trees. And so I would say that is the future of blockchain in games, is basically what we did with AI is just redefining it. And I think right now with blockchain in this huge crash, in this huge winter, I think there's a real opportunity for someone to just plant their flag and be like, well, Web3 means this now, right? Mm-hmm. And a bunch of people will march off and follow them. And just as a closing thought, I just have to say how annoyed I am at the fact of how little web there is in Web3. You know, all these games are like downloadable Unity apps that you're sideloading onto your Android phone or playing only on your desktop. Like a couple of them run in the web, like Splinterlands and Zedrun. You know, that's good. But like, I want to see more web in my Web3, if you're going to use that term.
Right.
Anyway, and that's my spiel.
I think that's a very, very nice ending to this discussion. One of the examples that you kind of gave, I just realized Toho project. Basically, that's a metaverse already.
Yeah, it's like, you know, everyone's like, we want to have something like the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Yeah.
We used to have that. It was called the public domain.
Yeah.
You know, Robin Hood, Norse mythology, like every country's local mythology and stories for most of human history was this great cinematic universe we could all like reshare and reuse. And only in the last like 200 years has it all been enclosed for private use. And it's funny that in order to achieve the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Disney had to acquire basically everything in order to be able to achieve for themselves what everyone used to be able to do with the public domain like 300 years ago.
Yeah, this has been a very, very pleasant talk with you. And I mean, thank you very much.
I appreciate it.
It's very nice to have you, and good luck on whatever you're doing next.
You too. Yeah, sorry I talked so long. But yeah, it's a real pleasure. And shout out to everyone there in Taiwan. Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.